Dr. Brechin, let's talk about your book, which is titled Imperial San Francisco, Urban Power, Earthly Ruin. Why do you say imperial?
Oh, because all great cities are imperial. They rely on an ever-expanding hinterland to feed them and to continue their growth. And so I'm using San Francisco as an example of the way I think all great cities operate. The idea came to me when I was able to spend the winter in Venice. Venice is the most beautiful and ingenious city humans have ever created. But I came to realize in the time that I spent there that it became that way by raping and looting much of the Eastern Mediterranean in order to build itself. And the same applies to San
I
Francisco and
see.
especially to New York City. I was actually going to write a sequel called Imperial Manhattan because the East Coast press ignored my book because they thought that it was just about a pretty city way out there west of the Hudson.
Yeah, yeah,
So I
yeah.
wanted to show how it operates in New York City as well too. It could be applied to London, to Paris, to many other cities.
And why do you say earthly ruin?
Because cities use remote control technology, and that includes the military, to feed themselves, or rather to feed the people who own and run them, because this is all about the elites who actually call the shots and who control the mass media. The core of the book is called The Thought Shapers, about the people who shape our thought, but without our knowledge and certainly without our consent. We can come back to that. But so they use remote control to draw in and steal from the hinterland, which I use the Italian word contado. Um, the first thing that they need is water. And San Francisco really needed it because it's built on sand dunes. There's almost no creeks and it's surrounded by salt water.
Yeah.
So the second chapter is about how it builds its aqueducts into the country, just like Rome did, so that it could grow further. The second need, and probably as important, is energy. So you need lots of energy feeding into the city to keep it growing. At that time, it was wood, poor coal, etc., and then it becomes electricity. And a lot of this technology grows out of mining, which has been so important to San Francisco, and then is transferred to the rest of the world. Much of Silicon Valley's technologies is actually rooted in innovations in the mining industry in the 19th century.
So when you say earthly ruin, what you're referring to is that essentially San Francisco is plundering natural resources from the areas around it.
Yes, and an ever-expanding band. I was going to have a chapter on the forests because the forests all over California were sacrificed to build San Francisco, and railroads all around the Pacific Basin because the redwood is so good that it's used for all sorts of things like pipes, for example, and railroad ties, etc., but is mainly used for building. And so those are the first to go, the redwood trees around the Bay Area, and then the forests of the Sierra Nevada. But then fish, whales, everything is pulled into the maw of the growing city. I use the metaphor of the maelstrom from Edgar Allan Poe's wonderful short story, The Descent into the Maelstrom, about how it pulls bears and wolves and trees and everything in and just absorbs it and spits them up wasted or corpses, and that's what cities do. They have a metabolism. They pull things in and then they create immense amounts of waste.
But
But
there's
most people are not aware of that. As the city grows, it becomes more dependent on a growing hinterland or
yeah.
contado, but the people become less and less aware of their dependence. They just want it. And of the waste, it's really a question of out of sight, out of mind. So what my book tries to do is put it in sight and in mind to show what the environmental consequences of growing cities are. Cities today are growing both horizontally and vertically, infinitely, but nobody asks, how large should they be? They will continue growing until they can't any longer. And climate change and diminishing resources is about to put an end to urban growth. Adele, as I said, the idea came to me in Venice. And if you cross the Adriatic to Croatia on the other side, which was part of Venice's empire, you'll see the same thing. Now, it's a bit different because it's rocky and barren, as is the Middle East. That was all covered by trees, or much of it was, And what you're seeing is an artificial desert that was created because of the demands of cities.
Oh, wow. Similar
And
to
it's
what
the
I was
same for
just,
San Francisco.
yeah.
Yes.
In the minute we have left here, you and I had talked about, prior to this podcast, San Francisco's prime families, and you mentioned this in a prior segment, and this segment you talked about thought shapers. Could you talk about that for a minute? What are the powerful families of San Francisco that I guess are still relevant to this day?
Well, the powerful families of San Francisco are not evident today. In the past, they were the Spreckles family, whose fortune was based on Hawaiian sugar, the Hearst family, and the DeYoungs. And then there was another couple of brothers called the Scotts who were connected with the military. And most people have never heard of them. Anyway, these families owned the major news outlets, the Call, the Examiner, and the Chronicle. And they shaped the minds of the people within the city. What I do in my chapters in the Thought Shapers is to show what's in it for them. What else did they own? How did they use their control of mass media to benefit themselves? And that includes raising the value of the real estate that they owned that people didn't know that they owned. To some extent, they still do. The Hearst, for example, own land south of Market Street that's being developed now with high-rises. But most people don't know about these families, although at that time, somebody like William Randolph Hearst was very flamboyant. People, they knew about them. Today, most people couldn't name those who control the mass media and control their minds, except maybe for Rupert Murdoch. But otherwise, they've become largely invisible, and that's the way they want it. There's another interesting thing too, Adele, that it's very important to know who owns the land, because those people have the clout at City Hall. And back about 120 years ago, you could just get what was called a block book, and it would show all the proper names of the people who own the land in San Francisco. Today, if you can get a map that shows land ownership, and that's very difficult, you won't be able to tell because they're all hidden by corporate veils, LLCs and REITs and such. And so you can't tell who owns the land. So the land is being speculated on, but you don't know who it's being. But as I say, the people who own the land pick up the phone down at City Hall when they call.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So you don't know who's holding the levers of power.
One last thing.
Yeah.
Those families had an investment in the city. I mean, I'm a harsh critic of them in the book, but they had a sense of place. This was their city.
Yeah.
And they did a lot to build it up. One of the big changes that's happened with tech is the tech bros who come up from Silicon Valley with their incredible wealth. They don't have an investment in the place. They can live anywhere. That's what their technology is designed to do. They can be anywhere. And so they don't really.
You mean they don't have a sense of belonging and pride in San Francisco? Is that what you mean?
That's right, because they can be anywhere. They also they're very ahistorical, which is why I'm so glad you're doing this show, because they really don't think that history is important. They're building or winning the future, So San Francisco can't have a proper city museum like any world-class city does. It can't afford to support its art institute. It can't afford to support its city college. But in particular, it seems to have become very ahistorical. And I think that has a lot to do with the problems we're facing, that there is no longer this commitment to place that these old aristocratic families once had.
That's taking remote work a step further to sort of remote connectedness, right? Lack
Yes.
of
Mhm.
connectedness. I'll just end
Yes.
with this, to confirm what you were saying. The old rich prime families in San Francisco had a sense of belonging. For example, if you look at Legion of Honor, which is over, I guess, in the Lincoln Park area, right?
That's right. Mhm.
Which we visited a couple of years ago with my family. That was built by the Spreckles family.
That's right.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Thomas.
So yeah, so there was that sense of belonging, and this is our city. Let's take a break here. Stay with me and Dr. Brechin as we get into the perspective.